Good morning, guys, or whatever time it is when you're watching this. We are going to be moving into the third of the white paper selections. So give me a second here to make this thing start. Okay, today we're going to be going into a little bit more of the weeds. We want to dive into the details of what this means to do a white paper so that you're prepared for it as you move along through the semester. We are going to really talk about the differences between primary and secondary as well. Okay. First of all, let's do a real quick review of what IMRAD actually means. Again, this means that this is how things are going to move along in the paper that you write, with the introduction, the methods, the results, and the discussion. And with the discussion, we'll talk about whether you should have a conclusion or not. Okay, I talked about the introduction before. Why are you undertaking this research, right? What's the research question? What is the test of the hypothesis from? Recall that the white papers are to be written to an outside audience, right? Then you're testing this. The audience is educated. The audience is probably experts. They just aren't experts in your particular field. I know I've said that a number of times, but I really want you to understand that that's the case. You cannot talk down to your audience if you want to convince them or have them listen to you. One is, so we have the differences here between primary and secondary research and where they're going to fit in your white paper itself. If you did primary research for the class, that means you're probably in engineering or technology, you're probably also in senior design. You might be doing primary research in the natural sciences or with lab projects as well. That's possible. Possibly, if you're in the humanities sections and you're taking the class and you've chosen to do primary research, that means you're running surveys or questionnaires in an intensive way. So that's possible, but extraordinarily rare. But you're going to be answering the questions that we have to deal with in the IMRAD format. If you are primary, and remember, if you're using primary, you're using 3 to 5 secondary sources to give context to your research project. That's important. That's called a literature review, and I don't mean a literature review as in Shakespeare. I'm talking about the kinds of writing that exist on the topic that you are researching. So literature is just the word that academics give to that context. We're talking about a literature review. It's things that other people have written about your particular topic. Essentially, your smaller section of secondary research is looking at the sources of other projects, other experts, and other research that's been done to give context to how you're doing yours. Okay, so that's primary. If you're doing secondary, you will not include your literature review or your sources in this section, right? Because that's going to be the bulk of your research. So we'll talk about where that goes here in a little bit. So with the primary research, you offer the literature review as a context for your study, but with secondary research, your literature goes later, and here is just giving an overview of what you're doing and the background of it. Okay? Okay, in methods, that's another section that we're going to move forward into. You have when was your study done? What materials were used? What was included in the study groups? How did you get from point A to point B, basically? Okay. This is a class that is serious. It should be systematic. How did you gather the data from beginning to end? We should be able to tell. This is really hard for some students to get their heads around, as I've mentioned before. But the idea is that research does not appear in a vacuum. It doesn't magically appear, and you have to explain to your audience how you got it and where it came from. So we really want to convey in this particular class how research is done. How did you do it? If you're going into an industry situation like engineering or information technology, you need to know, how is the information collected and how is it dispersed? If you're going into more academic or science, like hard sciences or natural sciences, research is done all the time in a conventional sort of sense, but it doesn't, again, happen in a vacuum. We need to know how it works. if you are doing primary research, you'll have both qualitative and quantitative research. Okay, so qualitative and quantitative. Qualitative refers to the quality of how it's done, the narrative, the story, the description. Quantitative is the numbers, right? So the numbers of what you've collected. Both are valid types of research for primary, both qualitative and quantitative. Both are valuable, both are incredibly needed in all the disciplines, from the natural sciences all the way to engineering. But they do have different characteristics that are important for you to understand as you are trying to collect all this stuff and perform it. The validity of the test, the reproducibility of the test. Let's say, let me give you an example. Let's say you're doing a stress test on a newly designed something. Maybe you're mechanical engineering, and you're going to talk about that stress test. Explain what is it? Why did you balance it? Why is it important? And then talk about the fact that by doing this, anyone else could also presumably do the exact same test with the same results. It's reproducible. Same thing in natural sciences. Maybe you're doing biological examination of something, but you've got to be able to demonstrate how you got the results you did and how someone else could do those same results. Okay. If you're in primary and you're doing qualitative, there's a different set of information that's going to come up. You might be doing survey instruments, right? Well, surveys or interviews. Those are the dominant forms of qualitative primary research, and your research may or may not fit those particular molds, so you'll have to kind of think through what is it I'm doing and how am I doing it. With a survey instrument, you will probably put the full survey that you created as an appendix within the white paper itself. And an appendix is at the end. So then you'll be referring to the questions in the method section. Remember, we're still in the method section of your paper, still talking primary. If you are referring to those questions, you don't want to simply dump the entire survey directly into your test or into the white paper itself. You want to have it at the end and then refer to it in the method sections as a question. Question number 1, this is how it worked. Question number 2, this means that it doesn't disrupt the reading and people can understand what you did, the results of what you did. So you're going to parse it out. You're going to talk about the individual questions that you asked, and then reference the fact that you put the thing in the appendix, or where is it so they can find it. You're also going to talk about who your participants or subjects are and why you selected them and how you selected them. That's important. It's critical here because there are different populations that have different characteristics, and there's a reason, there has to be a reason for why you selected certain individuals, and not just because they were easy, right? So maybe you're going to interview teachers, but they need to be chosen teachers in your chosen field, not just any teacher, correct? You need to talk about that. And in some ways, it's how you sent out the survey or how you interviewed them. You need to describe the method of how that worked in the methods section. Now, let's move to the next one here. Okay, so in the method section, if you are secondary, things are a little dicier for you, and it may be a little shorter here. It might even be a simple paragraph if you are secondary. How did you systematically search for resources? You can't just say, well, I simply went to Google and just typed it in and took the first 5 hits, right? That's not systematic. We need to know how you went about finding your sources. The whole purpose of this class is to help you slow down, recognize what you're doing, and be able to articulate how you found the sources. Did you go meet with a librarian? Did they talk you through the databases? How did you choose them? Did you find someone else that is doing that has an existing data set of survey results that you are looking at? Maybe you can use those same data sets to kind of work with and continue on the testing, right? But you have to be able to sort of take apart those results. How did they get there? Where did they come from? Can you reproduce them still too, or even though you're doing secondary, right? And even though you're looking at somebody else's research. Here's also important to describe how you read and annotated, analyzed, or coded the information. Coding here does not refer to like coding computer. Coding here refers to looking for themes or trends within the reading and the sources that you are collecting. It might be easier to think of it as color coding, perhaps. Perhaps sources like, so how did you pick up themes? How did you notice trends? Maybe 3 to 5 sources said the same kind of thing. Did you notice that they were similar in their results? Maybe that's purple, right? If you're reading through all your sources and maybe you're coding purple, these sources are similar. And then I found sources that say another set of information about my particular thing. Maybe I'm going to color code them yellow. That's what I mean by coding. Different kinds of coding, secondary research. How did you do it? We want to know in this section. Okay, the next section is results. And again, we have some differences between primary and secondary. So you've talked about how and why you made the choices, how you collected whatever data you had. But how did you explain here, are the results binary, either or? You might have some testing results, which could be number heavy with percentages in the results. You might have statistical information. How can that data be represented? How can you design be met if this item is entering maybe in a technology program or an industry standard? Maybe you're going to explain the results here. So if you're coming at this particular white paper from one of the pre-professional programs like maybe engineering or technology, there are standards in those fields, and you probably are just beginning to understand those. But they're not just, you don't just spit out the results, right? There are reasons for why they are put in certain ways. But again, it's important to know that you are giving the results to people who are not necessarily in your field. So you have to be able to figure out how to do that. Moving to secondary real quickly here. In the results section, if you're doing secondary style research, your whole data collection is going to be a literature review. So here's where the literature review is going to go if you're doing secondary research. So this is going to be the biggest section for you if you are secondary, because all of your results are the sources that you found, right? Again, if you are doing primary, you are using the 3 to 5 sources that you found as context. They're going to be earlier in the paper. If you are secondary, you're going to be putting all of those here in the results, right? Because they're different results that you're aiming for. So this is going to be a big section for you. Don't forget you're using IEEE, and so you'll have, for the most part, most of you are using IEEE. If you are not using IEEE, you and I have had a conversation about it, and we have discussed why, and I've said yes. Otherwise, you're probably using IEEE. So let's say you've done research into, let's say green energy. And here's where you're going to say, these are the trends for the solar cells that are white. And these are the scholarly sources that talked about this, about that particular section of green energy. And then you're going to go to the next section and go, here's another section that I learned about green energy. And here's the part of the section that goes to that. So this section for you, if you're secondary, is going to be very paragraph heavy. And don't forget to include those citations. Okay, so discussion section. This is the same across the board for both primary and secondary research, right? Testing methods, discussion of what you found. Here's where you're going to have to make sure you've got visuals. Big important thing is that the picture is worth 1,000 words, but it has to be a good 1,000 words, right? It has to be able to explain to someone outside of your field what are the things and why. Basically the so what of the data you've collected. So what, right? This is where you're going to tell us, so what, this is why. Last section will be the conclusion. Some of you will have it, some of you will not. Some people include the conclusion within the discussion. Some people move it separately. Either of those is okay if it makes sense to what you're doing. If you have the conclusion, this might be where you advise someone who has read your stuff and read it very carefully. Maybe just a quick summary, but very quick. You don't want to re-summarize the entire thing. Final recommendations, discussions for future research, implications of your study, and what lessons that you learned, and maybe how you might do it differently if you did it again. Okay, so that gives you a real quick way of describing the differences.